In this video, I'm going to talk generally about psychological disorders and then two ways to look at understanding psychological disorders. So first of all, the definition for psychological disorder. It's a syndrome marked by a clinically significant disturbance in a person's life, in their thoughts, their feelings, and their behaviors, and it needs to be maladaptive in some way. So something is wrong with thoughts, something is off about feelings, something is off about behaviors, and again, it has to be maladaptive, which means if you have that sort of unique uncle who tends to be really picky about his food being separate on his plate, that's not a psychological disorder as long as he's still eating and as long as his life can go on just fine. It needs to be maladaptive. It needs to affect your functioning in your life for it to be a psychological disorder instead of you just being a slightly unique individual. So it has to reach that maladaptive stage. So some people can have hints of like obsessive compulsive traits, but not have obsessive compulsive disorder until maybe something happens later on and it moves it into that maladaptive stage. For example, some people might have signs of depression but not be diagnosed with depression until something happens that pushes them over that edge to the point where it's affecting their ability to function in daily life. So that's psychological disorders. And there's, again, two ways to sort of look at it that your book talks about. There's the medical model, and then there's the biopsychosocial approach that we talked about in chapter 1. So first, the medical model. And that one says that psychological disorders have a physical cause. It can be diagnosed, it can be treated, potentially cured. You're going to have some sort of treatment like therapy, maybe in a hospital, all that sort of doctor medical type stuff. So that's the medical model. So this model really started in the 1800s with the invention of psychiatric hospitals, medical treatments. Potentially in class we'll go over this. For example, using diabetic shock basically to try to treat medical disorders. So they would intentionally give someone an overdose of insulin to have them have a seizure. This was sort of the precursor to electroconvulsive therapies. And then once they had that seizure, then they could give them glucose to bring them out of it. Or the idea of ice baths, or even electric convulsive therapy. The precursor to that, the original form of it, would fall into this medical model. You need to treat them in a hospital. It is a disorder just like anything else medical. There's a physical cause to it, and thus you can treat it. Now, a more common perspective is going to be the biopsychosocial approach. And this is the concept that our behaviors, our thoughts, and our feelings are formed by the interaction of our biology, our psychology, and our social cultural environment. So you can't just look at one thing. You need to look at behaviors, thoughts, feelings in the form of biology, psychology, and the sociocultural environment. For example, schizophrenia. So schizophrenia has a biological component to it. There is a genetic predisposition to it. There's the psychological component. There's the disordered thoughts, the disordered emotions, the disordered behaviors that we'll talk about in class. And then there's the social cultural component. For example, what is going on in your environment that might trigger that underlying predisposition to schizophrenia. In class, we'll also talk about social cultural examples of psychological disorders. For example, the susto in Latin America. We'll talk about an example from Japan, potentially an example from Tahiti that we also mentioned in the emotion chapter. All those combination factors are going to be the biopsychosocial approach. This would be Andrea Yates and why she killed her 5 kids, looking at her subculture, looking at her genetics, the hormones, all of those factors combine to really understand psychological disorder. So these are 2 approaches or models to understand psychological disorders, and we'll go into specific types of psychological disorders in class.